Welcome to the YouTube channel of the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf, where we embark on a deep exploration of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your continued support means the world to us, and we kindly ask you to like and share this audiobook to broaden its reach, bringing the wisdom it holds to even more people. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to receive immediate notifications when new content is uploaded. Together, we can foster a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner tranquility by spreading the teachings of meditation and mindfulness. We are sincerely grateful for your involvement in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible. For your convenience, we've included a video playlist in the description below. Let's now begin today's reading. All four tetrads at once. July 19, 2021. When we read the suttas, we should remember that they were never meant to be read on their own. They were part of a community, the inherited knowledge of the community. In the early days, you would hear a sutta, and then you could ask the person reciting it, "What does this mean? What does that mean?" He could fill in the blanks. This personal interaction would play a necessary role because often there are quite a few blanks. You see this especially in the Buddha's instructions on breath meditation. They're his most complete set of meditation instructions, 16 steps in all, and yet they leave a lot of questions unanswered. So we have to look around, read some passages in the context of other suttas, try to make sense out of them, and talk them over with people who have practiced to gain a sense of what the passages might be getting at. The first big question is, are the 16 steps meant to be read and practiced in line, in other words 1 through 16? And the indication seems to be, no. They fall into four sets of four, called tetrads. The first tetrad has to do directly with the breath. The second tetrad has to do with feelings, the third with the mind, and the fourth with dhammas. It's not the case that you're going to focus on the body, and only when the body is all taken care of will you focus on feelings, and then wait until the feelings are all taken care before you focus on the mind, and then the dhammas. Actually, all four tetrads are present right from the start. The sutta itself, where the Buddha gives the most detailed explanation of these steps, indicates as much. It says that when you pay attention to the breath, the act of paying attention generates a feeling or is a feeling, the text says, but basically the act of attention helps to fabricate a feeling, what's called a feeling not of the flesh. As for the mind, it says that there's no mindfulness of breathing without mindfulness and alertness. And as for dhammas, qualities, you have to develop a quality of equanimity to put aside all your worldly concerns right from the beginning. So even as you're first settling in with the breath, you've got all four aspects right there. You can read the different tetrads as alternative instructions as to what to do as you get started. First, you analyze the problem. You're trying to settle down and the mind's not settling down. Is it a problem with the breath? Is it a problem with the feelings, the mind, or outside things coming in? Once you've identified the problem, then you can look at the appropriate tetrad to see what you might be doing wrong and what you can change. For example, with the first tetrad, the first two steps are to breathe in long and out long, breathe in short and out short. The next two steps are trainings. You train yourself to be aware of the whole body as you breathe in and out, and then you train yourself to breathe in and out, calming bodily fabrication, in other words, the intentional element of the breath, or the in and out breath itself. This last step can take you all the way to the fourth jhana. Another sutta confirms this, saying that when the bodily fabrication is fully calmed, that's where you're going to be. Fourth jhana. That's a very brief outline in how you deal with the breath. Actually, though, a lot more is going on. Ajahn Lee fills in quite a few more details. When the Buddha says to be aware of long breathing and short breathing, you can expand that. You can include deeper, shallow, heavier, light, faster, slow. And because you know from the second tetrad that you'll be trying to develop a sense of fullness or refreshment and pleasure with the breath, you can use the variations of the breath to help induce that sense of pleasure. Then you're aware of the whole body as you breathe in. You train yourself at this point. This is something you have to get good at. A lot of people have trouble with this. They're focused on one spot, then they try to be aware of the whole body, and very quickly find themselves back at one spot again. It takes a while to back into the sense of awareness that's filling the body all the time. Actually, you've already got a spotlight awareness and a background awareness. What you're trying to do is bring your background awareness up to the fore. As for calming bodily fabrication, we learn elsewhere that before you calm things down, you should energize them. Otherwise, you can put yourself to sleep. So first breathe in a way that's energizing and then allow things to relax. As your focus gets stronger and more consistent, you can stay with calmer breathing and not lose focus. If you find, though, that the breath gets so gentle that you can't keep track of it, you have to breathe a little bit more heavily again. That's the breath side of things. Then there's the feeling side. You breathe in and out, training yourself to be sensitive to rapture. In other words, there are potentials for rapture or refreshment in the body. Wherever there's a sense of fullness in the body, allow that sense of fullness to stay. This can just be the sense that it's full of blood or full of energy. There's a nice buzz, say, in your hands or in the middle of the chest. Allow that nice feeling to be unaffected by the in and out breathing. Don't squeeze it. That way it gets a chance to grow stronger. Even as you breathe out, allow this feeling to stay full. As it grows stronger, let it spread. It's usually accompanied by pleasure. Sometimes, though, the pleasure and the refreshment are two different things. After a while, the sense of refreshment or energy spreading gets to be a little bit too much. So you figure out how to tune into a subtler level of energy that's just pleasant, and you let the excess go out your eyes, out the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. The next step is to be sensitive to mental fabrications, which are feelings and perceptions. The step after that is to calm mental fabrications. This is where perceptions play a big role. You want to find perceptions that will create calmer feelings, because you're going to go from rapture down to pleasure, and then ultimately to equanimity. What kind of perceptions help with that? Patanjali recommends perceiving the whole body as saturated with breath energy flowing in different parts of the body. In some cases, it flows up, in some cases, it flows down or circles around. So what way of perceiving the breathing would be most helpful right now to get things to calm down? When mental fabrication is totally calm, that can take you all the way through the formless jhanas. Here again, we see how the different tetrads are not lined up in a row. The first tetrad delivers you to the fourth jhana, but then the second tetrad starts way back with the first jhana, trying to develop a sense of rapture, before taking you up to the fourth jhana, and into the formless ones. So the two tetrads are best developed in parallel. The third tetrad follows a similar principle. It starts with being sensitive to the mind. If you haven't been sensitive to the mind up to this point, you're not going to get anywhere. As the Buddha said, the mind is right there all along. It has to be mindful and alert for you to stay with the breath from the very beginning. But sometimes the mind is the problem. So you look at it. You get sensitive to the state of the mind and then you notice. Does it need to be gladdened and energized? Okay, breathe in a way that gives it more energy. Breathe in a way that gives it a greater sense of rapture and well-being. Sometimes to gladden the mind you have to drop the breath and go to another theme that you find inspiring. Does the mind need to be more concentrated? Do what you can to get things really focused. Does it need to be released from its burdens? These are the different steps you follow in the third tetrad. In other words, you read your mind and then you energize it, then you steady and concentrate it, and then you release it. Those steps do follow in a logical order, but sometimes you have to jump around a little bit. You might have to steady things before you energize them. So this tetrad, too, starts at the very beginning and delivers you up through the jhanas and on through the various levels of release. The release here starts with what's called awareness release. The act of letting go of sensuality or sensual thoughts for the time being, letting go of any other unskillful qualities for the time being, or letting go of the factors of a lower state of concentration as you're trying to get into a higher one. It can also, though, go on to total release, which is what you want in the area of the mind. You want bodily fabrication to be calmed. You want mental fabrication to be calmed. But you especially want the mind to be released. The fourth tetrad gives you some idea of how to do that. First, you start with inconstancy. You notice how things arise and pass away. In the Buddha's descriptions of arising and passing away, he always notes that your knowledge has to be penetrative. In other words, you don't just see things coming and going, you also want to look into the mind to see why they come, why they go. And when they come, are they good? Are they the kind of things you want to encourage or not? That's what it means for knowledge to be penetrative. In the very beginning, the main focus is on the inconstancy of the things that are distracting you. The Buddha himself relates this particular tetrad to the task of putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. And when he taught Rahula breath meditation, even before he started with the first step, he had him contemplate various themes, one of which was inconstancy. This is where you use it. Suppose you suddenly think of something that happened years back. You have to remind yourself, that's gone. Or if you think of something you're anticipating in the future, remind yourself that even if it comes, it's going to go, too. We've been searching for happiness in things that change all the time. Isn't it time to look for something more reliable? Thinking in this way, you develop a sense of dispassion for the distraction. And it stops. When it stops, you put everything down. In other words, you don't have to keep thinking about how great it was that you were able to put that down. You put it down and then you get back to work. So those are the steps in the last tetrad. Focus on inconstancy, then on dispassion, then on cessation, then on letting go. As the concentration gets deeper, as you're going from one level of concentration to another, you want to see the factors that you're dropping as inconstant, not worthy of passion, so that you can put them down. Then, when the concentration is solid, you begin to notice that even it has its inconstancy. There are risings and fallings in the level of stress. So you look into them. What in the mind is causing them? Why does the stress go up? Why does it go down? You see what's causing it to go up and you realize you don't need that. You develop dispassion for it. And because your passion was driving it, dispassion makes it stop. Then you put everything down, including the insights that made things stop. This is the kind of analysis that ultimately can set you free. So the four tetrads are not to be lined up in a row, one after the other. They're to be lined up side by side. They're like a map with 4 pages. You unfold it and there are 4 sections. And it's good to have the map in the back of your mind. Don't put it in the front of your mind while you're meditating. That would be like trying to go through a forest looking at nothing but the map as you follow along the trail. You're going to run into trees, you're going to run into stumps, you're going to get bitten by a snake. Ideally, you first look at the map to get a sense of the general direction. Then you put it down and focus on the trail itself. In other words, you have the map of breath meditation in the back of your mind, but you got the breath in the forefront. And you realize that there are feelings right here, there are mind states right here, there are dhammas right here. You're trying to get them together in a way that's calm and clear. Use this map to figure out what's lacking, what needs to be added. This presence of mind with the breath right here. That's what it's all about. The map is there to give you an idea of how many facets there are to what you're doing right here, right now, because that's an important part of meditation. You commit to the meditation, but you also reflect on what you're doing. You realize that you're here not just to be with the object, but also to look at the mind as it relates to the object, because that's even more fascinating than the object. The breath does have lots of interesting details, especially in the workings of breath energy in the body. But the way the mind relates to objects is even more fascinating. The way it falls for its feelings and perceptions is even more interesting. The way it relates to itself is interesting. You want to be aware of all these facets, because only then does your vision becomes all around. We're students of the Buddha, who is said to have an all-around eye. He saw things from all angles, reflected on things from all sides. That was what enabled him to find a release that was total. Release all around. As he said, his mind was released everywhere. That's our teacher. So as we try to follow him, let's see if we can make our own awareness all around and released everywhere. 2. The Primacy of the Mind. 1. June 21, 2021. Mano Pubbingama Dhamma, the mind is the forerunner of all phenomena. The first line in the Dhammapada. It's well known, yet all too often when we come to meditation we forget it. We think that meditation is about simply accepting what comes in through the senses and going with the flow, in other words, putting the mind in a passive state where phenomena are the forerunners of the mind. But for the Buddha, the mind is primarily active. That's one of the principles we have to hold to. That's why it was put at the beginning of the Dhammapada. Always keep it in mind. We're not just going with the flow, because most of the flows described in the Pali Canon go down to whirlpools, places where there are monsters, alligators, rapids, waterfalls, dangerous places. To follow the path is to take a stance against that flow, so that we can avoid those dangers and get across the flow to the safety of the other shore. Look at the Buddha himself. He didn't simply go with the flow. If he had gone with the flow, he would have lived his life as a prince, maybe have become a king and then been forgotten, like all the other kings, princes, queens, and other quote-unquote important people in the world. But he took the quotes off. He really did become important by taking a stance. Think of it. Someone who wants to find the deathless and will do anything he can to find it. That's the kind of person he was, the kind of teacher we have. So, when we look at our own practice, we should cultivate a willingness to go for something more than the ordinary, instead of simply going with the flow. You see this from the very beginning. In the practice of generosity, you place yourself in the position of a creator. You create generosity, you create a gift. You can spend your time thinking about what would be a good gift to give to whom, and find some joy in exercising your imagination in acts of generosity, and then even more joy in carrying through. As for the precepts, you're strict about them. They're a promise you make to yourself that, no matter what, you're not going to lie, you're not going to steal, you're not going to have illicit sex, you're not going to kill or take intoxicants. You draw that line and then you begin to notice. What are the things that would push you over the line? In noticing those things, you begin to see your own mind in action. Those impulses that would push you over the line also create phenomena. They, too, are forerunners of phenomena. What kind of phenomena are they creating? What kind of phenomena are they going to push you toward? If you hadn't drawn a line, you wouldn't have noticed. This is why the precepts are clear-cut. When this is put in negative terms, they're described as hard and fast. People are against hard and fast rules. But look at the precepts from another point of view, and you realize they're clear-cut. They're easy to follow, easy to remember. Now, they may create some difficulties as you find yourself wanting to go with contrary impulses. But this is your sorting out. After all, this is what right mindfulness is all about. Noticing what's skillful and what's unskillful, and remembering what's skillful and unskillful, so that you can use your memories to direct your right efforts. You learn how to say no to the voices in the mind that say, well, just this once, or it doesn't matter, or this should be okay, other people do it. Other people do all kinds of things, even ordinarily good people let themselves get pushed around. But here again, think about the Buddha. He was not the sort of person to be pushed around. Think of the time he had to give up his austerities. The 5 monks who'd been attending to him gave up on him in disgust, but he didn't let that influence him at all. He realized that what he'd been doing was wrong, so he would have to stop. As for their opinion, he decided he couldn't let himself be pushed around by that. So, always think about the Buddha, what kind of person he was, because he's the person who lies behind the instructions, behind the training we follow. He was a truthful person, which is why his mind was able to find the truth. He was the sort of person who, once he'd seen something was unskillful, would give it up. As he said, once he'd given something up, he wouldn't take it back. His image was of someone who vomits something out. You don't eat the vomit. You let it go. As for things that are skillful, the mind has free range. This is what generosity is all about. There's a lot of freedom in generosity. There's room for creativity, and if you can't be generous with material things, there's always generosity with your time. Other people can give things, but it takes time to keep them in good shape, so see that as a gift, a good gift, as well. I noticed when I was in Thailand there were some monasteries that seemed pretty rundown, but they could have been fixed up fairly easily. I asked the local people about that, and they said, well, that building was built by so-and-so, and if we fix it up, it becomes their merit. The merit doesn't come to us. I don't know where they got that idea, because the commentary is full of talk about how when you clean up the monastery, you gain in wisdom. The place becomes new because of you. That becomes your merit. So, we look around and see opportunities for giving of ourselves. At the same time, we see opportunities where we have to draw the line and say no to unskillful things. It's in this way that your mind is not just reactive. This is how we know that the mind is not just a material thing or the byproduct of material processes, because if it were, we wouldn't be able to choose what we reacted to and what we didn't react to. We wouldn't be able to organize or choose our responses. We wouldn't have meaning in our lives. But when we take in the various events of the day and choose to organize a response, the more organized, the better. That's when we assert the primacy of the mind, which is what the Buddha's teachings are all about. As the Buddha saw, everyone has to go through aging, illness, and death. Nobody wants to, but most people just put up with it. It takes something more than just a material process to say, no. There must be something better. So here's where you assert the primacy of your mind. By laying down some rules for yourself, by giving yourself worthwhile goals. As long as you see that they're skillful, you stick with them. If you see that you've made a mistake, you can make changes and choose better goals. That, too, is part of the primacy of the mind. We're not a wind-up toy that has to do whatever the winder tells it to do. We have our sensitivity, so we can read our actions. This is why the Buddha said that you need both commitment and reflection to nourish the Dhamma. You commit yourself to something really good, and then you reflect as you follow through. If you begin to see it wasn't as good as you thought, you can change. If you see there are areas where you can be even stricter with yourself, well, you can make changes there as well. This then becomes the mind state you bring into the meditation, committed to staying with one object. If you already have practice in drawing lines for the mind in terms of your behavior outside, it'll be a lot easier to stay with your one object of concentration. At the same time, you've been training the mind to be active in thinking about generosity, thinking about virtue, and as you're watching the processes of the mind, those thoughts are good processes to watch. All too many people go through life letting their minds wander all over the place. When they come to meditate, all they see is that all over the place mind. It's not very inspiring and it's not very easy to watch. So, as you practice generosity and are strict in your virtue, you create the external circumstances that are good for meditation. You also create an inner mind state that conduces to meditation as well, conduces to concentration, conduces to discernment. It's all of a piece. This is how you organize your response to the facts of aging, illness, and death, how you organize your response to the realization that you are responsible for the suffering that weighs down the mind, which means that you can make a difference. You can choose to stop causing that suffering. So instead of going with the flow, you go against the flow. You take your stance to resist the flow. That's how you find something really solid, because you've put your mind first and made it, from the inside, as solid as you can. All phenomena are preceded by the mind or the heart. The first verse in the Dhammapada. Last night I talked about how people tend to forget this verse when they come to meditation, forgetting the active role of the mind. Tonight I'd like to talk a little bit more about the topic, because the principle is there not only in that first verse, it's throughout the Buddha's teachings. After all, with the Four Noble Truths, when the Buddha searches out the causes of suffering, they don't come from outside, they come from within. It's because of craving and ignorance that the mind creates suffering for itself. When you look at dependent co-arising, you find the same thing. Almost half of the factors are prior to sensory contact, our knowledge of the world outside. Among those prior factors are fabrications, your intentional acts and acts of attention. The things you pay attention to and the way you pay attention. These will shape what you see as you make contact with the world, what you hear, what you smell, what you taste, what you touch, and what you think. These things are all shaped by factors inside the mind acting prior to your experience of the outside world. Which is why we meditate by focusing inward. If the causes of suffering were outside, we'd be sending you outside to search them down. But they're here, inside. We have to keep that point in mind. The Buddha's teachings on breath meditation underline this. We're not watching just the breath, we're watching the process of fabrication, the processes of attention, as we watch the breath. I know people who say, why watch the breath? When you die there won't be any breath to watch, so what will you hold on to then? But in the way the Buddha teaches breath meditation in the 4 tetrads of the 16 steps, the big issue is fabrication, the mind's contribution. As you dig a little deeper, you find one of the big issues is also attention. The Buddha wants you to see how intentions and acts of attention shape your experience even of something as basic as the breath. Based on that, they shape your general experience of well-being or not well-being. He wants you to see this so that you can alert yourself to exactly how much suffering you're bringing to the situation. All too often we look outside, thinking that we're suffering because of this person or that person, this group of people, that group of people. But you can try to straighten out the world as much as you like, and there will still be suffering because the mind is still churning it out. As we sit here watching the breath, we're getting close to the real problem. Just learn how to look inside. That's when you find where the problem really is. Then, when you see the real problem, you can solve it. In the first tetrad of the instructions for breath meditation, the Buddha has you start out by discerning short breathing and long breathing. That should alert you to the fact that the way you breathe will have an impact on how you experience the body. Of course, short and long can be extended to include deep, shallow, heavy, light, fast, slow. Get a sense of the variations in the breath. Then the Buddha has you train yourself to be aware of the breath in the whole body. Be aware of the whole body as you breathe in, aware of the whole body as you breathe out. The 4th step is to calm bodily fabrication. Bodily fabrication is basically the in and out breath. You may want to know, why does the Buddha bring in a technical term here? It's because he wants you to see the extent to which the mind's intentions play a role in how you breathe. We learn from other places that when you get sensitive to fabrication, you first use it to energize the body, energize your sense of the body, and then you calm it down. So, you're basically asking yourself to be careful about the intentional element that shapes the way you breathe. After you've used it to energize yourself, then use it to be as gentle as possible, as calming as possible. At the same time, you're going to be dealing with feelings in the 2nd tetrad. When we see the 4 tetrads laid out on the page, it looks as if you have to go through the 1st tetrad, and then the 2nd tetrad, then the 3rd, then the 4th, but the Buddha explains them differently. When you look more carefully at them, you realize you're doing them in parallel. While you're dealing with the body, you're also dealing with feelings, so you try to breathe in and out in a way that gives rise to a sense of refreshment, breathe in and out in a way that gives rise to pleasure. How do you do that? The Buddha says that your careful attention to the breath is what will give rise to the sense of pleasure. Here again, the mind's contribution is what's going to make the difference. We're working here not with feelings willy-nilly. We're working with what the Buddha calls feelings not of the flesh. Nirmisa Vedana. Those are feelings that are consciously, deliberately created. So again, we're working from the mind into the breath. Then you're sensitive to how that sense of pleasure has an impact on the mind. You breathe in and out sensitive to mental fabrication, in other words, feelings and perceptions. So, what perceptions do you apply to the breath? How do you visualize the breath to yourself? How do you depict it to yourself as you breathe in, as you breathe out, where it's coming in, where it's going out, how it comes in, how it goes out? You may think of breath as something from the outside that you have to pull in. You can breathe in a way that's comfortable with that perception, As long as you think of the whole body as being open to the breath coming in, going out from all directions, through every pore. After a while, though, you begin to realize that an even more calming perception is of the breath originating from inside. After all, it's the energy in the body that pulls the air in through the nose. The air can't force its way in on its own. Where does that energy originate? Ajahn Lee lists a couple of what he calls resting spots of the breath. Above the navel, at the tip of the sternum, the base of the throat, the palate, the middle of the head, the top of the head. Experiment to see which of these centers is most congenial for you to place your attention on, and then think of the breath radiating out from there without any interference. If any sense of tension gets in the way, think of it dissolving away. So again, it's the way you pay attention to these feelings, along with your intention to calm the mind. This is what shapes your experience right now. Then you can find an even more calming perception. Think of all the cells of the body breathing together at the same time. No one cell is more predominant than any other, no one spot in the body is more predominant than any other. That's even more calming, both for the body and for the mind. Then you get to the third tetrad, which you're actually doing at the same time being sensitive to the state of the mind and then noticing. When does it need to be gladdened and energized? When does it need to be steadied and made more concentrated? How do you release the mind from any of its burdens? You're doing all of this at the same time that you're dealing with body and feelings. These are all issues that'll be determined by attention and fabrication, attention and intention. It's what the mind brings to the practice that's going to make a difference. As you learn these lessons from the breath, you learn them in a very immediate and visceral way, and then you can apply them wherever you go. After all, the breath goes with you wherever you go, and you can take your sensitivity to what you're doing wherever you go as well. This way, you keep your focus at the right spot. Of course, you're aware of what other people are doing, aware of what's going on outside, but you don't let that awareness obscure your knowledge of what you're doing inside, because that's where the real problem is. As long as you allow this inside area to be obscured, you're going to suffer no matter how perfect things may be outside. But if we can be knowledgeable about what we're bringing, honest with ourselves, open with ourselves, there's a chance for us to see what we're doing and to stop creating the suffering. This is why when the Buddha was teaching Rahula, the very beginning of the lesson was about honesty and, from there, being self-observant. What are you doing? What do you expect to gain from your intentions? Which ones should you act on? When you act only on skillful intentions, what happens? If something bad comes up as a result, you have to ask yourself, maybe my intention was good, but it wasn't skillful. Go back to the drawing board. So you reflect. Remember the Buddha's image to Rahula. Your actions are like a mirror. It's through your actions that you can see your own mind. And it's because the mind is the forerunner of all things, it's also the forerunner of suffering, and you can see where it's coming from in the mind. It's also the forerunner of creating the path you want to be able to get it to develop the needed skills, and observe it as it's doing that as well. The breath is a good mirror for the mind. Whatever intentions come up, whatever acts of attention come up, they're reflected in how you experience your breath. But we tend to look past this mirror and, as a result, we don't see ourselves. So keep the mirror polished and keep your eye on the mirror, because all the things you need to know will be seen right here. Keep your options open. November 27, 2019. As we practice, we're exploring possibilities, trying to expand our range of possibilities. When you look at the Buddha's quest for awakening, you see that he tried out many paths, but there were some paths he didn't try, because he saw that those would actually close down possibilities. One was the path of saying that everything you did was preordained, you had no choices, so you simply had to accept what came. That's not a path you can experiment with, and it's not a path you can explore. It closes off lots of possibilities, so that's a path he didn't take. Another assumption that he didn't try was that we can't observe ourselves, we have to depend on somebody else to do all the observing for us. The whole principle of how he practiced was to look at his own actions, and if they weren't getting the results he wanted, to see what might be changed. Which assumes, of course, that we can observe our own actions. This is why he said later on that the mind is luminous. That statement is sometimes interpreted to mean that the mind is innately pure, innately awakened. But in context, it doesn't mean that. He says, it's because the mind is luminous that it can be developed. In other words, it can watch itself. A thought comes through the mind and you can watch the thought. It gives results. You can watch the results. You can see the connections. Those are some of the assumptions we make as we explore possibilities with the purpose of expanding them. This is what the Four Noble Truths are all about. They expand our sense of what's possible. As for the third noble truth, that the total end of suffering is possible. Some of the other teachers in the Buddha's time would say, suffering will end, but there's nothing you can do about it. You can't speed up the process, a very fatalistic teaching. Others were saying, you do have choices, but your choices can't get you to any place that's totally unconditioned, because after all, actions are conditions. So in the third and fourth noble truths, the Buddha was saying something radical. There is an unconditioned happiness, and there's something you can do to get there. That required a new view of causality, which is one of the reasons why the Buddha took principles of causality so seriously. His was a principle of causality that allowed for developing skills. In other words, there are some things that come in from the past. Results of past actions that come into the present moment. Then there are choices you make in the present moment that don't have to be shaped by those past actions, and those give results now and into the future. So, there is a pattern that you can learn, but at the same time you do have freedom of choice within that pattern. When the Buddha expressed his awakening in the shortest terms, it was that principle of causality. And a few times when he went out to, you might say, pick fights with other teachers, to criticize them, to search them out, to criticize them, it was all over issues of causality. Because a principle that allows for skillfulness is an important principle to hold to. You can develop skills, and you will develop as a person. The more skills you have, if they really are skillful, then the more options you open for yourself. A view of causality that doesn't allow for the development of skills closes all the doors. That's why the Buddha took causality so seriously. So, right now we're working on concentration, we're working on expanding our options, expanding our possibilities, keeping in mind the connection between the practice of concentration and the rest of the path, and the relationship between the path and the end of suffering. Part of the purpose of being on the path is to create concentration as an alternative to other forms of pleasure. A lot of insight lies in seeing that certain things are worth doing, and certain things are not worth doing. Your idea of what's worth doing will depend on your range of skills. Think about little children before they can speak. They just make nonsense syllables, and for them, that's worth doing. When they finally get the hang of language, there's not much use for nonsense syllables anymore. Think of the games you played as a child that were a good exercise for the body. As the body grew and developed more abilities, those childish games were no longer worth doing. Your range had expanded. You had a better idea of what's worth doing and what's not. In the same way, the pleasure that comes from concentration is one of those things that allow us to see that it is possible to find a happiness that doesn't depend on sensuality. There is this option. When you take this option seriously and actually develop it, you can look back on your old sensual pleasures and gain a much better perspective on them. A lot of the things that you used to pursue don't seem worth pursuing anymore. The friends who used to pursue those things with you, you begin to wonder what was that friendship all about. And for quite a while, the practice of concentration will seem very satisfactory. I remember when I was first teaching here in California, we had a weekend devoted to the Four Noble Truths. We got to the third noble truth first, and then the fourth noble truth. People were saying that the third noble truth, dispassion, cessation, didn't seem all that attractive, but the fourth noble truth, especially right concentration, with the rapture and bliss, that was very attractive. So, you develop what's attractive until you begin to see its limitations. This is why knowledge of the third noble truth is so useful, so important. To remind you that no matter how good the concentration gets, there is something better. When you're ready to see the drawbacks of concentration, ready to admit the limitations, you don't have to be stuck. There is an opening to something better there. So, work on your concentration, expand your range. This will expand your sense of what is possible and also expand your range of yourself. Because with every skill that you develop, you create a new self to go along with the skill. I've read a couple of pieces, some even written by monks, saying, if you actually work on concentration, it's going to require a sense of self. After all, you have to make an effort, and you have to think about how you're going to benefit from this in the future, and you have to have a sense of you as a person capable of doing this, all of which creates a lot of use, lots of selves. But we all know that the teaching is about getting rid of our sense of self. So don't try to create any concentration. Just learn how to be satisfied with what you've got, and there won't be any self around that. That's what one monk said. But that's just keeping your range of options very narrow. If, within that very narrow range, you're going to be deciding what's worth doing, what's not worth doing, the choices will be pretty limited. Your old lazy selves will take over after all. A lot of lazy selves can develop around telling yourself to be satisfied with what you've got. So, yes, we are creating new selves as we practice concentration, but they're good selves to add to your inner committee, and they change the balance of power, tipping it in the right direction. Then, as the skill gets more and more mastered, those senses of self can fade into the background as you get focused on the skill in and of itself. As you get more sensitive to what the mind is doing to create this state of concentration, you begin to see that it really is fabricated, it really is put together. Then there will come a point where you're ready to see the drawbacks of the fact that it is fabricated. And the mind will develop naturally at that point. It develops because you push it. In other words, you're not just letting it grow every old which way. It's like a tree. You take a tree and you make a bonsai out of it, and it looks pretty unnatural, but it's the tree's natural reaction to a certain kind of training. In the same way, getting the mind into concentration is the mind's natural reaction to the training. And when you begin to see the limitations to the concentration itself, and realize you don't want to go back to your old pre-concentration days, you start looking around. What other options are there? When you see the option of something unfabricated, you'll naturally want to go there. Now, that option wouldn't have opened up without a lot of training. But the desire to go for it is the mind's natural reaction to the training. That's why there's such an intimate relationship between the third and the fourth noble truths. That third truth is there to remind you of this possibility. Some people say, why did the Buddha put the third noble truth, the end of suffering, prior to the path to the end? It's like a doctor's diagnosis. The doctor describes the symptoms, tells you where the symptoms come from, and then tells you whether it is possible or not to cure the disease by treating the cause. Once the doctor has established that possibility, then there's the path, the treatment. Now, as we're meditating, we're not focusing on nibbana. If you're practicing jhana, you're not even focusing on jhana, you're focusing on your breath. But you're focusing on the breath not for its own sake, it's for the sake of the concentration, and you're developing the concentration for the sake of something unfabricated. Always keep that perspective in the back of your mind, that range of possibilities. Don't close off possibilities for yourself. Always do your best to keep your best options open. Unfabricated happiness. June 10, 2019. When the Buddha taught breath meditation, he started out with 4 very simple steps. You discern long breathing, you discern short breathing, you try to breathe in and out aware of the entire body. Then, in the 4th step, he introduced a technical term, fabrication, or sankhara. You try to breathe in and out calming bodily fabrication. That's another word for the in and out breath. The question is, why did he use the technical term? You see it again in the next 4 steps. First, you try to breathe in and out sensitive to rapture, any sense of refreshment that you feel while you're sitting here. Try to focus on that, let it spread throughout the body. Then breathe in and out sensitive to pleasure, a sense of ease. Then he says to breathe in and out sensitive to mental fabrications, which are feelings and perceptions. Now, you're already dealing with feelings, and in particular, that feeling of ease. Then there's the step of breathing in and out calming mental fabrication. So again, why did he use the technical term? The answer is that the Buddha's trying to get you to think in terms of fabrication. In general, fabrication means things that are put together, processes that put things together. But specifically, the term refers to what you're doing to fabricate your own experience. Input comes into the senses and you don't receive it with everything already marked and identified as to what's important, and what's not. You have to do the identification. That's perception. You have to do the evaluating. That's more fabrication. In these ways, you shape your experience. We play a much bigger role in that shaping than we tend to think, and the Buddha wants you to get sensitive to that role. For instance, simply the way you intend to breathe consciously or unconsciously has an impact on how you experience the body. The feelings you focus on, the perceptions you use, have an impact on the mind. Then there's a third kind of fabrication, called verbal fabrication, where you talk to yourself. That plays a role in the instructions to the meditation themselves. Things you tell yourself, such as, I'm going to breathe this way, I'm going to breathe that way, I'm going to focus on this, focus on that as I breathe in and out. The Buddha wants you to calm that fabrication, too. This helps you gain a sense of how the way you normally fabricate things causes a lot of unnecessary stress and suffering. The more stirred up your fabrications, the more you're going to suffer. 1. Simply out of the effort to put these things together, and 2. You can come up with all kinds of ideas, perceptions, thoughts, feelings that can wreak a lot of havoc in the mind. When the mind is punishing itself this way, it's going to suffer, and the punishment doesn't stop there. It spreads out to other people. So follow the Buddha's instructions. Try to get sensitive to how the way you breathe has an impact on the body, and use the breath in a way that feels soothing, gives rise to feelings of pleasure, gives rise to feelings of refreshment. When the body's been energized, then you can allow it to grow calm. At the same time, look at the perceptions you're holding in mind right now. What kind of perception do you have of the breath? If you think of it simply as air coming in and out through the nostrils, it's going to be hard to use the breath to help spread those feelings of ease and well-being around the body. But if you think of the breath as a flow of energy, it'll be easier. After all, the muscles have to move, the body has to move so that the air can come in and out of the lungs well. What is that movement? It's breath energy. Where does it come from? Where does it originate in the body? And as you feel that movement spreading through the body, does it feel good or does it feel constricted? Try to become sensitive to these things so that you can use the breath energy skillfully. We're perfectly free to breathe any way we want. Why let yourself breathe in a way that's creating unnecessary stress? The usual reason is because you're not paying attention. You think other things are more important. But here again, the Buddha's pointing your attention to how the way you breathe is going to have an impact on your mood. Your mood, of course, is going to have an impact on the things you do and say and think. So it's wise to get sensitive to this aspect of your experience, to get more and more sensitive to how you really are shaping things, to see the potentials you have here, and how you can make the best use of them. We focus on fabrication because ultimately we're looking for an unfabricated pleasure, something you don't have to put together. But you won't really know the unfabricated until you've gotten very sensitive to how you fabricate your experience of the present moment. It's not that everything is served to you ready-made, already finished. You have to put things together. You have to put the finishing touches on them so that they become a coherent experience. The mind is active in its creation of the present moment. Now, we don't create it totally out of whole cloth. Some things do come in from our past actions, but when the Buddha explains the list of causes for suffering, the input from the senses, which is what comes from your past actions, comes after this process of fabrication. The way you fabricate your experience, if you do it in ignorance, already primes you to suffer from that experience, regardless of the input from the senses. If you fabricate with knowledge, that fabrication and everything following from it will become a path to the end of suffering. The more sensitive you become as you fabricate a good path here, in other words, a good state of concentration, mindful, alert, ardent, the more you can develop a sense of ease that you can spread through the body. You get a sense of refreshment you can spread through the body. You spread your awareness through the body. Your sensitivity develops and grows. Things that used to strike you as okay suddenly feel a bit too stressful. You begin to notice, more and more, how you're shaping things and how there's stress in the shaping. And you look at why. Why are you creating the stress? Well, there's desire, and as the Buddha said, not all desires are bad. Some desires, when you engage in them with knowledge, can be part of the path. But often our desires are ignorant, and they fuel our fabrication in lots of ways that are conflicting, afflicting. As you get more sensitive here, you begin to wonder why you get engaged. Why create these things? After all, you're not simply on the receiving end. You're creating these things, and then you're suffering from them. When you see that the suffering coming from these things is far greater than the allure that makes you want to create them to begin with, then you feel dispassion. Dispassion then allows these processes of fabrication to fall away, because passion was what was driving them. When these processes fall away, then something unfabricated can appear. It's always there, but we're too busy to see it, busy creating our fabrications as to what we want here, what we want there, what we think this is, what we think that is, and if it's not what we want it to be, what can we do to make it what we want it to be? That kind of stuff. That's always getting in the way. But when you stop that process, then something outside of processes, outside of time, appears in the mind. That's the ultimate happiness. That's the unfabricated. I've known people who ask, how can we as conditioned beings find something unfabricated? But they're assuming that we're conditioned by something totally outside of our control. Either a creator God or just material laws, physical laws. But the Buddha's analysis is that, no, we're creating the present moment on our own initiative using the raw materials, as I said, that come from past karma, pointing the present moment in different directions. Because we're creating it, we can take it apart. When we take it apart, that's when we can find something that's not fabricated. This afternoon we talked about the image of happiness as being like a roller coaster, going up and down, and then thinking of nibbana as getting to the up and then not going down again. But it's not like that. It's actually beyond the up. Wherever there's up, there's going to be down. The roller coaster is in space and time. The happiness of nibbana, the well-being of nibbana, the bliss, all that's covered by one word in Pali: happiness, bliss, well-being, pleasure. The word is sukha. That's not dependent on anything in time. It's not dependent on anything fabricated. It's not dependent on anything at all, which is why it doesn't change. It's in a different dimension, but it can be contacted here at the mind, when the mind stops its fabrication. So listen to the Buddha's instructions. He's showing you that even the way you breathe is fabricating your experience of the body, and your experience of the body is going to have an impact on feelings. Those feelings are going to have an impact on the mind. The way you talk to yourself, the perceptions you hold in mind as you identify this as this and that as that, what you want out of this and want out of that. Try to get sensitive to all these things, to see where they're placing unnecessary stress on the mind. The more you can get sensitive to different levels of stress, the more you'll be able to unravel the process of fabrication to that point of awakening where the unfabricated appears. As the Buddha said, it's true happiness, harmless happiness, blameless happiness, one of those rare forms of happiness that really is more than worth the effort that goes into finding it, both for your own well-being and the well-being of people around you. In alignment with the teachings of the Buddha, we emphasize the profound importance of sharing wisdom far and wide. We've made this extensive 1,000-page work accessible in audio format, and the responsibility to further this noble cause now rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a central role in the widespread dissemination of these teachings, which can benefit numerous others. Let's continue the timeless tradition of spreading knowledge and nurturing mindfulness for the betterment of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can make a profound and positive impact on the lives of many.